Welcome to the Be the Bridge podcast. I am Latasha Morrison, and we have something special for you today. So, we do our cultural views, is where we take a pause and we kind of look at what's happening in the world, what's impacting our groups, what's impacting this conversation on racial literacy and bridge building. And so, there are some things that we want to discuss today to tool and fuel and hopefully ignite some of our listeners and our group leaders. And so, as you know, the Be the Bridge podcast is a resource and a tool for our community. We want you to pass these podcasts on so that you are sharing information with your community and your neighbors and your family. And today, we are doing cultural views, and we have at the table none other than Mr. Sean Watkins and Mrs. Elizabeth Behrens and Mr. Micah Smith. This is the staff of Be the Bridge. And so when we do cultural views, we will bring our staff on and we're going to have a conversation, really modeling how this conversation could look in our Be the Bridge group. We're going to make this information available to you for the cultural views segment so that you can have our notes and be able to look at this. Elizabeth has graciously done a lot of research for us on this particular podcast. So we're doing two things today. Are you ready? Drum roll, please. I'm going to put a pause. I want the effects. We are going to be talking about white Christian nationalism, and some people call it Christian nationalism, but we're going to tell you why we're putting the term white Christian nationalism on there. We're also going to talk about book bans. So these are two things that are happening in our culture right now that are really impacting our community, our groups. And so we're going to have this conversation, and a high level conversation dealing with the racial literacy. There's a lot of intersections in this, but we're going to deal with the racial literacy portion of these big topics. And Sean's eyes just got really large. I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but we're having a conversation. So this is more informal but formal. And we want to make sure that we are, equipping you to do this work. And so I just want to start off with just giving a framework for Christian nationalism. And then I'm going to let Elizabeth really give us some historical, we call her history barons. She's going to give us some historical context. And Sean and Micah will chime in from time to time. And then we have a list of questions that we're going to go through. Okay. But Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that really idolizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from the top to the bottom. In its self-identity interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, public policies, and it aims to keep it that way. Let me repeat that again. So Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from the top to the bottom. As we say in the African American community, from the rooter to the tutor. And its self-identity, its interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policy. Christian nationalism aims to keep all of this way. And the other thing that I want to continue to read all of this. It says adherents believe in the idea that America was founded by Christians who modeled its laws and institutions after Protestant ideals, with the mission to spread the religion and those ideals in the face of threats from non-whites, non-Christians, and immigrants. And while Christian nationalism in the country finds its roots hundreds of years ago, the phenomenon phenomenon bubbles up during periods when white Christians feel threatened by outside forces, amplified by war, heightened immigration, or periods of economic instability. Christian nationalism in the United States is exclusionary and nostalgic, seeing that the nation is going downhill and needing to be recaptured by people who see themselves as the rightful owners, possibly through authoritarian means. And so, Elizabeth, I want, first of all, I want any comments on what I just read. Um, what are some first thoughts that come up? And then I want you to just kind of give us this background of some historical context, which we think is really important when we're having conversations like this, is the historical context.
Of course. As you're reading that, the thing that comes to mind is this idea of through lines through history, of narrative arcs that happen through history. And so people wonder, like, why is Christian nationalism all of a sudden this term that's being used? And we can contextualize it with things that are happening today, but what's happening today makes so much more sense when you see it's played out repeatedly over and over and over again throughout history, that this idea of Christian nationalism, waxes and wanes over time, and that what's happening today perfectly fits with other waxing periods in history. And so once you can see that, I think it really helps you make more sense of why it's happening, and then also how to counteract it, like what kind of stamped it down in the past, and what does that maybe look like for us in the present day as we think about it. But to really figure this out, you really do have to go all the way back to the founding of our country, or the first colonists that came over. And you have to realize, like, we were a colony. We were a colony of England. And England was a Protestant Christian nation. That was their national religion. That was, to be English was to be Christian. Those were synonymous terms. And so when you had, when we were an English colony, we were a Christian colony by definition. And so I think now, what does that mean? I mean, that basically meant the government said it was officially Christian. That didn't have to mean that the people in it were, and that certainly didn't mean that the policies and the practices of the nation were in line with Christian ethics. It simply meant that it really was a political terminology. And so, as the colonies are growing and increasing, and they're not just being inhabited by people from England, there's this ongoing tension of, like, are we a Christian nation or aren't we? But we can look at our early laws and we see how, we used English common law, again, since we were an English colony. And so in English common law, it refers to it refers to British people as Christians in the law. Like, that was, again, a political term. And so you start to see that in early American law as well, simply because it's, really a carryover. But once we, declared independence, wrote our own constitution, we start to see that shift out, and we see the word Christian shift to the word white. Now, the reality was that wasn't really a change in definition. It was just a change in terminology. They meant the same thing. If you look in early law, it referred to Christian people and then various slurs of other communities. And it meant nothing about the professed faith of the people there. In fact, when they were trying to get the Constitution passed, one of the biggest barriers they had to overcome were some of the founders who wanted the U.S. to declare itself to also be a Christian nation. But the bulk of the founding fathers disagreed and refused to put any mention of God into the Constitution, or any semblance of Christianity into the Constitution. Which is a much different belief than some people hold today within Christian nationalist circles. But that was the big argument of the day, was, are we going to be a Christian nation or not? And it was very much decided that was not going to be the identity of our country, that we were going to be a country that was based more on a concepts of religious freedom, which was definitely revolutionary for its day. Now, what that meant, what that looked like, wouldn't seem revolutionary today, but at the time it really was.
Yeah. And I think that would go back even to, if you go further into European history and why people probably wanted to separate, because being a Protestant, England becoming a Protestant nation was hard fought. There were a lot of wars, that took place with some of the Scandinavian countries and the forming of England. So we're not going to go back that far.
No.
But I'm saying this is
We'd be
like
here all day.
history gives an account. And so you would have
It
to
does.
research even European history and how even Europe became, how England became, a Protestant nation. And so there's a lot of history with that. So we're going to move back on over into these here Americas. And I think you just answered this question, has America been a Christian nation, and what does that idea come from? Because when me as a African American person, I think there's this thing where we have this cultural religion, but but there's also this personal relationship and the abiding by the words of Jesus, And so when you look, some people look at that differently, where they're a cultural Christian, but what does it look like when we talk about orthodoxy and orthopraxy and in our everyday lives? And so for me as an African American, knowing the history here, it's hard for me to even say that America was a Christian nation. What are some of your thoughts, Sean, when it comes to saying that, has America been a Christian nation? And what does that idea, we kind of know where the idea came from, because Elizabeth just broke that down very eloquently. And so what I just want you to chime in with your thoughts. And then Micah, I would want to get your thoughts on this also.
Much, Tasha. Good morning to everybody and all of our listeners. I was laughing because Elizabeth and I are on the training team together, and we both love history. And she started, I thought she was going back to Rome and Constantine, and
I know, because you really should go back there. We actually should go back there.
It was like she kept going back. I was like, Lord, she's finna go to Plato's Republic in Act 5. Like, she's going back to the very beginnings of like categorizing people based on phenotype and everything. So, it's fascinating. I think there are these two narratives that America has about itself. Right, there's one narrative where Americans believe the myths and the legends about itself that allows it to have this innocence, right? Because it's ignorant of the past. And so they don't know what actually has happened. Like, we're Americans. This is a Christian nation. We've always cared about people. We've always been a nation of immigrants. We've always embraced these biblical principles. Well, that's like the narrative that we write on paper. But if we actually go back and look in our history, like Elizabeth was saying, we've actually never demonstrated that. Our nation was birthed really out of genocide and enslavement. And so even though we said that we're a Christian nation, we've been violent from day one. And so I think you look at the horrors of the shootings, the mass shootings that are happening in the country right now, you have a number of Americans that are saying, how is this possible? Well, again, if you go back and look at our history, we've been violent. We've never not been violent, to use a hood metaphor. Double negative, they cancel out and it works. We never not been violent. So it's a triple one for emphasis. So I think when you look at Christian nationalism, there is this notion again, right, that we are a Christian nation. Well, it kind of boils down to ethics. The folks that came to this country, how do they live out their faith? Do they live out an inclusive faith that says that there are Native Americans here that are present, that are talking about the great warrior, this creator who, in much of their iconography, is one God, but really in three parts? That's true for a number of Native American cultures and African cultures as well. Well, that was dismissed. There's an African presence in the Bible. That was dismissed. You had Mexican sisters and brothers that were living in the land. They were ignored and marginalized. We banned Chinese people from coming to the country for almost a century. And so you begin to see these narratives that have taken place, these issues and events that have taken place, that the Christians in the country said, The only ones that we're going to listen to are those of European descent. Every other ethnic group will not be believed, valued, or really seen as human. And so when that happens, you cease to have Christianity. You have what Carl Ellis Jr. calls Christianityism. It's a version of Christianity that really is masquerading something frightening. And in this instance, what we have in America is Christianity that prays. It's Christianity, or rather white supremacy, that prays. It's a white supremacy that just puts a cross on top of it and says, God is not going to evaluate our culture, but our culture will dictate what God cannot do. God is for us and God is against the rest of you. And so that's deeply problematic. But that's also the realities of what we see happening in our country right now. Tasha, you and I both know one of the old stereotypes that happens from Christianity is that it is a white man's religion. And we really don't talk about that anymore in apologetics or in African-American apologetics. I think that narrative is shifted, but it was a narrative for some time. That's what gave rise to the Nation of Islam in the African-American community, because the only version of Christianity that we got was one that centered on white people. We got a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. The only ethical issues that we talked about were those that were relevant to the white community. The only theological issues that we talked about were only relevant to the white community. And so again, you see not just in dictation in the laws, but in demonstration, right, of how these things were lived out in the country. And America really has never been a Christian nation. We've had some Christian ideals, but when we decide to wake up and choose violence, we have no problem banning another ethnic group, exploiting another ethnic group, and then saying that God actually blesses that. And so we've taken the horrible parts, I think, really of Scripture, and we've made them the norm in our nation. And the consequence of that is all of the foolishness that we see happening right now.
Yeah, that's so good. I think one of the things that Elizabeth said was white and Christian are synonymous terms in the colonial American law. And I think that's key for us to understand that. And one of the things you said, when we talk about apologetics, we're having to talk about it now. Jude 3 Project, Lisa Fields just did a documentary called Unspoken. And it's really addressing that, because now with everything that we're seeing from Charlottesville to Charleston, South Carolina, to all the, the synagogue, like all the things that we're seeing, we are getting questions, from this next generation, this current generation, that Christianity is a white man's religion again, like more so than what you saw in the 70s. And I just had my goddaughter just sent me a message, and she was looking for some research. She leads a small group. She's 23, just turned 23, and she leads a small group at her church. But this is coming up for in that age group, in that college age group, where they don't see themselves in Christianity because of the how they're seeing it being lived out in front of them and the things that are being attached to it. Micah, I wanted, what do you think people mean when they use the term Christian nationalist? Just the term Christian nationalist.
Hey, yes, white man here, and I just want to say that I actually resonate a good bit with some of the stuff Sean said, so I want to touch on that just real quick before I get
I was
into
like,
it.
How's he gonna start? I knew he was gonna start petty. I felt it. He was smiling the whole time. I knew it.
It was just interesting because, I grew up in the moral majority that was very influential culture in my upbringing, and it's interesting how a lot of Christianity of America, of America's founding, was really read in and emphasized, and a lot of the global impact of Christianity was eliminated. So we saw it was very much read the Bible and think white people, instead of that being related to 3 continents that were not North America. And there was, yes, there was some European, but, when people came across, when we think about Christian nationalism and really the founding of America, from the vantage point of growing up in it, you think about the Puritans and seeking religious freedom and the Mayflower Compact, and those sort of things are really built up as the founding of the nation. And when you read the Mayflower Compact, it does talk a lot about, having undertaken for the glory of God, in the name of God, so we're like, yes, Christian nation, that's where we were founded. And it's not until those beliefs started to be challenged that I started to see, oh, this is a narrative. It's not the fullness of the history. And even within that narrative, you're leaving out things like 1619 when you're talking about the Mayflower Compact in 1620. You're leaving out the origination of the slave trade coming to the colonies, at least the first documentation of it. You're also misreading it, because when I read the Mayflower Compact, what I read is Manifest Destiny more than I read just Christianity. It's more God is ordaining us to overtake this land and the people in it. And that really leads into the genocide point that Sean brought up. I do think that there were, and I want to make this point, that there were Christian individuals within the nation, within the colonies. Now, probably not living it out well, but they were existent. But that does not mean that we were a Christian nation. Even within the Mayflower Compact, that was formed largely because there was a group of Puritans on the Mayflower along with a group of tradesmen and indentured servants. And so that was formed out of tension that happened even there within religion, and people who are non-religious. So there's a lot more context that I didn't have growing up within this idea of white Christian nationalism. Now, to get back more to where your question was, what is white Christian nationalism? Because that is a hard one. And it's interesting because I was reading it wasn't a Pew Research study, but more that they asked a question, and they just simply asked, I actually looked that up. It was how Americans describe Christian nationalism. And so it's all over the place, depending on who you are. But the very first one says people who love God and the USA, right? So I think a lot of people look at it that way. And there's nothing wrong with loving God, right? None of us would say there's anything wrong with loving God. And I have mixed feelings about the USA, but I understand that people have some warm feelings towards our place of origin, that sort of thing. There's a lot of, like, I was born in the USA, raised here, so obviously I have some feelings and perspectives about that. So Christian nationalism isn't necessarily, well, there's something wrong with being a Christian, or there's something wrong with appreciating aspects of the nation you live in. A couple of issues I see are, when you look at nationalism, it's more than just appreciating your nation. It's more you elevate your nation to the exclusion and detriment of other people, and you see them as a threat to your way of life. And so that's where we got to watch out for the nationalism aspect of it. And then with the Christian nationalism, conceptually, it's more about how what is your primary lens. So are you viewing God, are you viewing your faith through the lens of your love of America, of your love of these ideals around really the mythology of Christian nation? Is that framing how you view God and you view living out your faith? So if that's the case, then God and your Christianity starts to look a lot like protection of the nation and glorification of the nation, and the nation can do no wrong, and so you're very defensive of the nation, and God becomes like a mascot for that. So it's important to really consider what is your primary lens, because as Christians, we need to be putting that lens first. We need to be saying, what should this look like if I'm living out my faith? And making sure that we're framing how we live into patriotism, or however we want to engagement in government. Those sort of things should be driven by the lens of Jesus and who he was as God in flesh, because he gives us lots of examples of how to engage. As in my upbringing, we didn't really talk about Jesus as a political figure, or we didn't talk about power structures, but it is there. And so we can look at how he lived in the world in a way that affected the kingdom, and how did he challenge power and use power, even not just with Roman government, but looking at like the Sanhedrin as a political power structure. Right. So I think there's a lot of struggle in thinking about how to frame white nationalism, and how to really conceptualize it. But within it, to me, it boils down to, people love God in the USA, but they tend to glorify the government more than they glorify God.
Yeah. Why do you think, Elizabeth, why do you think there's this, all of a sudden, this talk about Christian nationalism? This is different. 15 years ago, we didn't hear it as much. But, you think about now, why do you think there's all this talk? And then I also want you to kind of talk about the differences between patriotism and nationalism. Okay. But why are we talking? Why are we having to have this podcast now? Why are there so many books being read? There are so many podcasts. There are so many conversations about this now. Why are we here?
There's $1 million
in a Be the Bridge way.
Right. So again, I want to pull back to the narrative arc. And Sean had promised to not go to ancient Near East. I think when we think about this idea of a national narrative, the story we tell about ourselves, that our origin story is really important. Like I said, this idea of that founding. And another aspect of that founding was this idea that there were a lot of groups coming over and colonizing parts of North, Central, and South America. When America tells its origin story, it very specifically focuses on the story of the Pilgrims, despite the fact that at the time of the Pilgrims, the area that's now the U.S. was actually much more heavily colonized by the Spanish than the English. A lot more of our origin story is actually Spanish in origin, but we kind of write that part out because it doesn't fit the narrative. We like this narrative that we find with the idea of the Puritans and these people who had this pure religion, and they were, pursuing religious freedom. And this is who we come from. And part of that was that they held a deeply religious belief that they were the new Israel, that they were God's new chosen people. And that's where we get manifest destiny from. That's where we get these ideas that they were supposed to come in and conquered, like a new reliving out of the Old Testament story. And we get from that this narrative of being God's chosen people, and at the same time that's married with God's chosen people are white. It's coming from other realms. It's also coming from within theology. Theology is shifting to back that up. And so this narrative comes back up whenever there are times of crisis. So we see this came back up in the 1830s and 40s. In the era, there was a lot of immigration. There was a lot of unrest. We're leading up to the Civil War. We actually see that in the Confederacy declared itself an explicitly Christian nation, in saying that they were going to be the ones that were going to get back to our true mission as God's chosen people, which included whiteness, which included slavery. That was part of the narrative of being God's chosen people, was upholding this ideal of being white Protestants. So it kind of backs off a little while after the Civil War, and things are kind of settling down. It comes back up. Between the world wars, there's a lot more unrest again. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's economic uncertainty. There's also a lot of, at the time we had things starting to happen like the Scopes trial and things that made sort of the subset of Christianity that started to really solidify itself, that called themselves fundamentalists or eventually evangelicals as well. The terms kind of shift with time. It's not it's not like hard and fast rules of definitions, but this idea of, the nation government is starting to go against us. And so we have to hold fast to this idea that we're still God's chosen people. And we start to see almost this subculture forming out of that. Because there's this fear that that the country has gotten away from God. And that's what it means to have a country that's saying like, well, maybe we shouldn't have explicit prayer in school. Maybe that's not the best idea. Or who's deciding what's being prayed and which theologies are we okay with, or are we not? Like there's a lot around that. And this actually pulls in with the topic you brought up earlier today. There's, this comes back up again more recently as there's again this big narrative push of this culture war between those who are clinging to these fundamental Christian evangelical beliefs, whatever terminology you want to put around that, and this supposed and apparently this government that's going against the nation's ideals, against the nation's founding. There's this battle between they're going way out, the government's going way off track, off of this Christian focus of being God's chosen nation. And so you see that, especially we saw this pop up, and it started to pop up significantly more after Obama was elected. That's part of why I think we can't take the word white off of the Christian nationalism conversation, because that's when we see its resurgence again, is there's this fear of this Black man in the White House. And that's why you started to see maybe he's Muslim. Maybe where's he really from? He's not really one of us. He's not a white Protestant. And we don't want to see him as with either of those terms. That doesn't fit the narrative. So that's why we see in 2012, there's literally a Christian nationalism Bible that comes out. I remember it's the Bible for the American Patriot or something like that. And you read the description and it's explicit white Christian nationalism, with devotions to tell you all about the founding fathers and their deeply held beliefs and how the Bible was woven into our founding documents. It's this whole rewriting of the narrative, because again, there's this fear, there's big change, that things look different, there's upheaval. To the point that we even see, in the wake of the election of Biden and the January 6th hearings, we actually had in those hearings, if you are a nerd like me and watched them, there was Rusty Bowers was on there. And he literally comes out and says it's a tenet of his faith to say that the Constitution was a divinely inspired document, which through most of Christian history would have been heresy to say, right? To say that anything but the Bible was divinely inspired. That used to be way outside the realm, but it didn't raise alarm bells. In fact, Liz Cheney came back on after that, in her closing statements, and says, we were reminded by Speaker Bowers that our Constitution is indeed a divinely inspired document. So we see this return. There is fear, there is upheaval, there is a clinging to power, there's a clinging to control, and it just keeps resurfacing. And there's a time right now amidst COVID and amidst wars happening around the world and crises, again, the waxing and waning of immigration patterns. So we see whenever there's big influxes of immigration, we see a resurgence of white Christian nationalism. We have all of those things happening right now. That's our reality. Our world is a little topsy-turvy. And so this gives people a sense of control. It gives them a sense of grounding. It makes them feel everything would be okay if we just fill in the blank. When it's not true. It's never been true. But it gives people a sense of control. And when the world feels deeply out of control, people cling to anything that makes them think, if we did this, then everything would be okay. But Sean, I think Sean's I have something to interject.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I agree with Elizabeth and Micah 100%. I wanted to both respond to Elizabeth, but go back to something that Micah was saying as well too at the beginning. We had our Be the Bridge leadership summit a couple of months ago, and one of our partners and volunteers Pastor Daryl Ford said something that was really profound. He was on a panel with Mariah Humphreys, who's our director of marketing and innovation. And Daryl said something that is on the very surface of the text of scripture, but he just said it, he articulated it in a way in which Micah and I were both on the side, like whisper screaming, like, yes, which is what you see in scripture. There's a command to love your neighbor. There's not a command to love your country. And that's an example of Christian nationalism. Like, what are some of the examples that we see in scripture? God's going to send Abraham and make him into a great nation. We see some of that. We see when they're in exile, right, in Jeremiah 29, seek the peace and prosperity of the place to which I've called you. There's this ethic in scripture about us loving God, loving people, and loving the land, being in relationship with the land. We don't own the land. We're in relationship with it. But what we see in Christian nationalism
Say that again. Say that again, bro.
What we see, like in scripture, is this trifecta of, like, we love God, we love people, and we love the land. We're in a relationship with the land. We don't own it. It's not ours. We steward it. And so, but in Christian nationalism, you own the land, you protect the land. As a matter of fact, the land is more important than people's lives, which is how Kyle Rittenhouse can take a gun and cross state lines and shoot people who are protesting racial injustice. And he gets away because he's protecting the land over people's lives. That's an example of Christian nationalism. And so, again, I think to Micah's point, right, we see this notion of, in scripture, you love God and you love your neighbor, right? And the land is to be stewarded. But we don't see that. We see love the land and fight your enemy, or fight your neighbor, right, if you will. And so I think that's part of it, which Micah was illustrating masterfully. I think the other thing that I wanted to be able to say, kind of in response to Elizabeth as well, too, y'all know it. I talk about him all the time, but there's a white history professor, as in he is white and male, not he studies white history, but he's a history professor who is white, named Dr. Mark Miller. Got to clarify in these podcast streets. His name is Mark Miller, and he talks about 5 links in a chain of a destruction of a community. That anytime we see a dominant culture and a subdominant culture collide, and that minority or subdominant group disappears, it doesn't matter what country it's in, what time period it's in, these 5 links always take place. And so the first one is identification. You've got to pick a people group to blame your problems on. Like, the issues that are happening in our society right now, it's the blacks. They're lazy. They're not working. They're welfare queens. They just want to munch off the government. The former president of the United States, when he announced he was running for office, came down his escalator and said all these derogatory things about Mexican people, and immediately put a target on this entire diaspora from Central and South America, right? So it's identification. The second step really is marginalization. Once I've identified a people group, I can push them out of the mainstream economy. We're looking for a certain kind of clientele to live in this neighborhood. I'm not going to sell you a house here. I don't think you'd actually enjoy it. The neighbors are concerned. We're looking for a certain demographic to work in this organization, right? You can push them out of the mainstream economy. Identification, marginalization. The third step is confiscation. And that's where we see the over-policing of these marginalized communities. Because we've identified a people group and we've said that there are problems present, well, then now we have to send law enforcement into those communities to make sure that they're not actually committing crimes. African Americans, we make up 12% of the population, but African American males ages 18 to 49, 50% of them have a criminal record or are under the control of the criminal justice system in America. Now, that data also contradicts what Brian Stevens and them are doing with the Equal Justice Initiative and the amount of wrongful incarcerations and convictions that we've had for Black and brown people in the country, right? So you've got confiscation where we can over-police them and take their things. The fourth step is concentration. If I can take your things, at some point I can take you. Hi, Japanese internment camps. Hi, Nazi concentration camps. Take your pick, right? You identify them, you marginalize them, you can confiscate their things, you concentrate them into particular communities or in the ghettos, if you will, and the slums around the world. And then the fifth step really is just extermination. You can just start murdering people. And so I think when you see people of every ethnic background, whether they're white, folks like Elizabeth and Micah who've done the hard work, African Americans, our Latinx brothers and sisters, our indigenous brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, who have a history, right? We have a collective memory of these things. When we start to say things about people in mainstream media, when we start to marginalize them, when we see the rise in Asian hate happening around the country, when we see an increase not in the unarmed shootings of African Americans, but when we see an increase in the recordings, right? When it becomes mainstream news, that for us is a clear signal of the danger that's happening, that we are on these 5 stages. And so that's one of the consequences of Christian nationalism, to have a community come in and say that we are God's chosen people, and to identify every other group that is not white and not male, and to say they are the reason why we are having problems in the land and in the country. They have to be marginalized. They have to be pushed out. They have to be over policed because they're committing crimes. They have to be arrested because they're a danger to society. Well, let's just start shooting them, because that's really the way in which it ends up. I'll say this and then I'll pause for a second. I think when I first started working here, and we were, I think one of the first things that Tasha had said was like, Sean, we've very much been in a black-white binary, both, her doing work in Texas, and then Be the Bridge being rooted in Georgia. And so we were saying, one of the first edicts Tasha gave was, I want to have an inclusive Be the Bridge. We've got to represent all the different diasporas that are present. And so I think I said 2 sentences, and Elizabeth said, that's all I needed. And so we all started doing research and trying to figure out how to update our trainings and to be inclusive of things. And I remember I went for a walk one day after our trainings. I think I told you this, Tasha. And there was a historical marker that was outside of my godparents' house where I used to live when I was renting from them. And it said, dedicated to the true Christians in the United States, protecting the land from the savages that sought to destroy American democracy. And I was like, that. I mean, it was very rusted, but the fact that there was a marker that was put up from the 1700s that said, we killed the indigenous population under God's authority in order to build a godly nation, and isn't it wonderful? That's frightening. To know that there were Christians in the land that believed God saw them as human and saw everybody else as subhuman, and as a consequence, they got to kill them. And that ideology continues to this day. What we see happening in January 6th, what we see happening with the book burns, this is not old. I mean, this is not new, rather. This is a very, very old conversation that our elders remember from all of our communities, both those that have horrible memories from these, but they also have like accurate memories of this as well too. So it's definitely something for us to consider.
Yeah, this is good.
Like you were saying, Sean, and I was saying, like, we talk about the origin story, like how important that origin story narrative is. And when you have that dominant culture and the subdominant cultures and the coming up against each other, one of the ways that you do that part of the erasure there too is, it's like, I don't have to change my origin story. I don't have to change my origin myth if I can erase yours. And sometimes it's erasing the human people, or sometimes to counteract any pushback to the conception of white Christian nationalism, you ban what people can learn. You ban books, you change AP Black History curriculum, you figure out how to control what the next generation believes. And we've seen this both from 2 fronts really happening. One, there is this banning, there is this like enforcing certain curriculums. You can't even talk about these things. You can't, teachers can get sued and whatnot. And then there's also, what we saw when school desegregation was happening, the start and the really big push to more of private. First, it was private segregation academies, and then it was shifted more to private Christian schools, private parochial schools, private really ritzy country club schools, all of those things. But I think what's really interesting within that is if you look at the publishing companies that started up at that exact same time as those schools were starting up, some of I will not name drop. I will keep us out of a lawsuit. But there are several.
I want to know. We can edit it out.
You afterward.
I can add
there
one.
There are several Christian publishing companies that started at that exact same time to publish curriculum, to publish K-12 curriculum, and their curriculum to this day, if you read the history curriculum, it promotes white Christian nationalism outright. I will say, without having to name their names, the top 3 best-selling Christian curriculums in the US today
Becca.
promote white Christian nationalism. The top 3.
Okay.
The most used for homeschoolers, the top 3 curriculums used for homeschoolers, the top 3 curriculums used in private Christian schools promote Christian nationalism. And those textbook companies have existed since the 50s and 60s. So you now have a couple generations where kids grew up on this. They had kids. They put their kids in those same schools with those same curriculums. You now have multiple generations who have been indoctrinated in this since the time they were learning to read. So of course, that's what they believe. Of course, that when you segregate yourself off, and you only are only learning from others who are making money off of that segregating yourself off. Yeah, they're not going to put themselves out of business. They're not going to teach the same things that you can learn in other history curriculums. That's a very specific worldview promoted with a specific purpose, and it's working. It's working.
Can I speak to this real quick? I want to say a couple things. One is our training team is so knowledgeable. And they walk through things so well. I'm just sitting here kind of listening to Sean and Elizabeth talk, and I'm just like, okay, yes, these people are awesome. So I'm so glad I'm sitting here learning from y'all and interjecting a statement every now and then. But when I think about white Christian nationalism, feeding off of what's been said, there is a real challenge to challenging the foundation of what we've learned about America and its founding. It shook me, it's kind of made me feel a little bit like I was grasping and I wasn't sure, like, oh, everything I believe is kind of falling apart sort of thing. And so I do think out of that, there is this urge to push back and be like, no, you're challenging something that is right and pure. And we talk about government sometimes in ways I've noticed that's concerning, like around January 6th, for instance, Trump specifically tweeted out something about the sacred election, right? Results. And Biden also made a statement about these sacred halls. So it's not like a partisan issue here. It's like across the board.
Yeah.
There is this linking between our government institutions and these set apart religious frameworks that are our government. And so it's hard to challenge that when that's part of who your identity. So that's one thing. And yes, homeschool curriculum does reinforce this. As a homeschool dad, I can say that. And I know, Latasha, you said we could say names, and I heard you say Becca. I will say Good and Beautiful, because I really thought that their history curriculum, when we bought it, apparently they had a board that was like looking across to consider it. And when we got it, they talked about Thomas Jefferson and his happy slaves, and then they also had sections in there that were really pushing back against this modern culture attempt to destroy our nation, right? And uphold this idea of like the 1776 pushback. I read that, and it was very much just this mythological ideology that upholds us wanting to feel good about ourselves, us wanting to hold on and not be put in this place of discomfort and uncertainty. And in the system, one, I had the power to not have to worry about that. It all just lined up for so many years for me because of my intersection of most of the privileges, if not all of them. That's where I sit. And so everything lined up really well for me. And I got to enjoy that, if I can say it that way. But also, when things start challenging me, it's easy to get defensive. It's easy to say, well, that really disrupts the way I think about things. And that's a threat to me and my identity and how I think about things. But I would just encourage and say it's important to kind of lean into that, because these things aren't sacred and holy. These are, I like the way Sean framed it earlier. These are good ideas. They're ideas of like, okay, maybe we can govern this way. Maybe these are some ideals that we can work towards of equality and justice for all. Even though at that time, we have to also be able to say these are man-made systems. They are imperfect. They are broken. And so we can also say that was a nice ideal by a bunch of people who owned slaves and by a bunch of people who had policies of extermination of native nations. And, all of the sort of things that they engaged in that worked against the very ideals. We have to be able to be honest about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And as we lean into that honesty, it doesn't make us worse. It doesn't threaten our existence. It actually gives us opportunity to build something, to work towards something that lives out kingdom ideals that we should be seeking. Kingdom ideals like recognizing the inherent value of each person, recognizing that people who are coming in as immigrants that are often framed as threats to the white Christian nationalism perspective actually bring some understanding, bring some context, maybe can help us learn things that we're missing, can add to the tapestry that we claim we're weaving. So it's just really important to allow yourself to not get caught up in that mindset. That's where I think I would really challenge yourself. I would never have called myself a white nationalist, a Christian nationalist, a white Christian nationalist. We can mix them all three, right? That was a word in the 90s I would have never thought to describe myself as. But I do think as I look back at it, I can make the delineation in how at that point I had put America on a pedestal. I had put America as a chosen land. I had put America at the center of Christianity. Yeah, and so you idolize and you glorify, and it becomes your God. So if you find yourself unwilling to genuinely and authentically challenge like those systems, then you might be a white Christian nationalist. Not intentionally. That's not. I don't think a lot of us are out there just saying, "Oh, we want to just tear other people down," but that's a framework, and that's going to lead you to, like Sean walked through much better than me, so I won't go over it, but in the long run, you're going to dehumanize and marginalize and justify hurting people in the name of religion. And that just goes back, like Elizabeth's been saying, to this whole history of manifest destiny and all of these other things that cause so much harm that reflects the world and its brokenness and not the kingdom and what it's trying the ideal vision that we're trying to live into.
One of the things I see, it's hard to hear. There's this statistic that says 70 to 80% of white evangelicals believe some form of Christian nationalism. How do we disciple people through this? What does discipleship look like, leading people who have brought into Christian nationalism? Pastor Sean.
Thank you so much. Don't mind if I do. So I think we, one of the things that we do when we do our trainings at Be the Bridge, especially if we're working with a faith-based organization or a Christian organization, the first thing that we do on day one, and I think the whole team has really kind of seen that, we walk through a biblical understanding of diversity. I don't want to talk about critical race theory. I don't want to talk about white Christian nationalism, any of the polarizing, hot button, trending themes that CNN or Fox News or Twitter or any of these other social media news networks. Just put all it off to the side. Let's just open scripture. And so the first thing we'll do is we just examine that. We look at the ways in which you see a diversity in God's creation. From Genesis, the ways in which God calls Abraham to leave his country, his family, his father's household. Well, if he's leaving his country, he's going to another country, right? He's going to be displaced for the rest of his life. Every conversation he has is going to be a cross-cultural conversation. We look at Jeremiah and him trying to stand up to the state. And what happens? The king puts him in a cistern. Well, there's a guy from North Africa that is a eunuch that actually is the one who's advocating for Jeremiah, this Jewish man, to be pulled out of the cistern. And so Again, we just add culture to the text that we're seeing. Same thing goes with Esther. She's a beautiful woman of a different ethnic background, and that's why she's chosen, right? We see racism and injustice all through scripture. And so for us, it's not a matter of trying to convince somebody of something that is not true or is, an antithetical to the gospel. It's helping them to realize that the lenses through which they viewed scripture are off or not clean or not clear. And so one of the things that our training team, we always tell people at the very beginning is we're not trying to change what you think. We want you to evaluate your experiences. What have you been taught? One thing that I always say and tell everyone, listen, you don't have to agree with me. Just here's your homework assignment. Go home and segregate your books. Go home and segregate your books. Put every book that you have that's written by someone white on one side, someone black on another side, someone Asian on another side, someone Latinx or Latino on one side, and someone who's indigenous or Native American on the other side. And all I want you to be able to do is segregate your books and just see who you've been listening to, who shaped your thinking, your theology. And so in doing that alone, more often than not, if someone is teachable, like Mike and Elizabeth were saying earlier, then there's a softness of heart that emerges because you realize you've only been listening to one people group from one context for your entire life. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to be able to do. This is a discipleship issue. And so I think it's important for us to turn to scripture and then we circle back and say, okay, who's been shaping your thinking? One of the things that I do in a class that I teach at Gordon Conwell is there's another book by Mark Knoll. It's called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. And it talks about massively what Elizabeth and Micah were just talking about, that one of the biggest reasons why the Civil War comes around is because you have Christians in the country, white Christians in the country, that do not know what to do about slavery, and they do not know what to do about non-white people. And it creates a theological crisis in the country that before the Civil War, the church was the leading influence in the nation. We talk about that separation of church and state. That was a letter that the Danbury Baptists actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson that said the state needs to stay out of the church. The church needs to continue to be a prevailing influence. But again, those white Christians, right, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and the Quakers, they didn't know what to do with Native Americans or with African enslaved peoples, or the fact that we had Mexican sisters and brothers that were living in the land. And you had the Asian diaspora that was like, whoa, they finding gold in America, people buying houses and building families. We want in. So what do we do with those things? And rather than saying, let's figure out how to have a beautifully diverse nation, they said, nah, let's just keep it for ourselves. Well, you cease to be Christian and you become a version of Christianity then. And so I think it's important for us to recognize this is a discipleship issue. It's not a political one. It's not just an ethical one. It very much is. How does Jesus shape how you view the world? And how does Jesus help you to see different people that exist in the world? If you only see God at work in your culture, that's a problem. If you see God at work in all cultures, well, then there's a posture of humility that you have when you approach cross-cultural conversations. But if you're right and you have the true gospel and everybody else is wrong, as the old black folks say, baby, if it's something wrong with everybody, it's something wrong with you.
Yeah. You see, we always bringing up those old sayings, but
look, they right and true.
Yeah. I think I wanted to, when we think about this, I feel like there's a crisis of discipleship because I feel like the very people who pastors who are leading, who should be discipling, sometimes it's being reinforced in the seminary schools that they come from, this ideology and these experiences. And so how do we, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have to exist as an organization, is because there is a theological problem that we have. We are not an institution, but we're having to make something right that has really been wrong. In 2000, I think it was in 2017, I was actually, I can't remember the year of, when was Charlottesville? That was 2017. They all start running together for me. I think it was 2017.
Yeah,
but that Charlottesville happened like on the weekend, but I know that Monday, that same week, I had to speak at a church in Michigan. And I remember at the end of the talk, this guy coming up to me, and he took his hands and he took both hands and he crossed them together, doing them like this. And he looked at me and he said, the Bible and the Constitution are intricately connected. He said the Bible and he looked at me and he said, I am a constitutionalist and the Bible and the Constitution are connected. And first of all, I'm feeling all types of feelings from what just happened in Charlottesville. Just thinking about the world my father was born into, my grandmother, my grandparents, my great grandparents, my family history and origin and story. And I was like, well, how bold of you to say this to an African American woman. And the thing I looked back at him and said, I said, you're talking about the Constitution that says I was 3/5 of a person. The Constitution that wouldn't allow my dad to be educated, where he wanted to be educated. The Constitution that said that my grandmother couldn't vote until she was in her 30s. Like, when you think about the foolishness of, and I want to say foolishness of saying something like that with the history like we have, how do you, what a pastor that's listening now, what would be some practical things that you would say, to start with? Maybe we can list some books or something, some readings. I'm telling people right now is, hey, why don't you spend a year in the Gospels, understanding what Jesus did, what Jesus said, how Jesus moved, like really getting to reacquaint yourself with Jesus. That's one of the things that I'm doing. What would be some things that you guys would suggest? Because this person was a member of that church. Like, we have people, like, these people are being discipled, but not discipled into Jesus. And then I think there's some pastors that just don't know how to answer this or how to separate this, like what kind of Micah said, because it becomes a part of your identity and how you've been informed. What would you say, to some of the pastors and Bible teachers and evangelists that are just listening now, that are just at a loss with all of this?
I'm going to say first thing is to take the American flag off of your stage, your pulpit, your...
Well,
come out and say it, because honestly, you walk into... I mean, I grew up with the Christian flag on one side and the American flag on the other. And if we don't think that our theology is shaped by our place and our space, then we're not being honest with ourselves. Whatever, you get pushback to saying that, but I like to think of, Jesus preaching in the temple. And if he was like, actually, before I preach to you, if someone could go ahead and bring in an emblem of Rome here to be behind me to honor our country, to honor this empire, like
to honor Caesar,
and then sing their song,
right? Outside and then we're going to close with a song about God blessing Rome, That's not, he wouldn't have done it. He wouldn't have done it. And if in our head we're saying, well, he wouldn't have done it because Rome was evil and the U.S. is what's your origin story about the U.S.? If you say like, no, it's okay for us to sing that or to put the flag up there because the U.S. is different than Rome. How? Different than Rome. How? We've committed genocide. We've enslaved people. We put people in concentration camps. Yes, we are a different country than Rome was an empire. But let's be honest with ourselves, because if we are saying, no, the U.S. is different because, then we are buying into the white Christian nationalist origin story. And so if that's the pushback, then you can say to your congregation, okay, we need to deeply invest in engaging our origin story. And that may not start at a country level. That may be like, why was this church founded? And I think a lot of churches need to look into that and be open with themselves, because you look at a lot massive suburban churches that started because of white flight, because the suburbs were built to be white enclaves. And if a church is not including that in their origin story, if they are not including that when they celebrate their history, they do their 10-year anniversary, their 50-year anniversary, whatever it is, we aren't telling the truth about where we came from, about why we exist, even at the micro level of this individual building, then we can't expect people to engage in an honest origin story about something much as broad as the country and the ideology around that.
I would add, have three words coming to me: curiosity, Christ, and an alternative. And so you can tell I'm not a preacher because they didn't all start with C.
I was waiting for it. Did not grow up Baptist.
I was waiting for it.
But one is like, how do we instill curiosity? I feel like that's something that's missing. It's a lot easier to say, I'm going to quickly like demonize, vilify someone who thinks differently than me. How instead do I find some curiosity about them? They might think differently than me. Why? What's driving that? Where does that come from? And so you're leaning in a little bit more in that sense when you're engaging from that direction, not automatically looking at them as someone separate and evil, but saying, maybe there's something to this. Maybe not. I mean, I'm not saying you have to take on everything anyone believes, but you're going to at least be able to entertain some different ideas and let those ideas challenge you. Maybe there's something I've been missing. I often think a lot of times that I have a full understanding of how something works, and I'll start by shutting off somebody. It's like they have nothing to teach me, but then they start talking and I was like, oh, I didn't know that. And so like having that curiosity about other people's story, about where other people are getting their information can be really helpful in starting to break down some of these walls. In a non-threatening way and in a counterculture way, really, to how things are being done right now. Another one is Christ. I heard someone say recently that the biggest crisis in Christianity right now isn't like orthodoxy or orthopraxy, but it's Christology, because Christ is missing in Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I see that a lot. People are like, we have to push this policy, we have to get power, even no matter who it hurts, in order to like put this into place to protect Christianity. We're going to spend a lot of time arguing over biblical concepts, but who Christ is and how he engaged in the world is not a part of that concept. And one of my like guiding verses is Matthew 22, when he's asked, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And it is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. And all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Mm-hmm. And I think we kind of just exclude that part. We're supposed to be trying to honor and glorify God, not a nation, not a group, not a denomination, but honor and glorify God with everything that we got. We're loving him. And I think those two, the is like it is so important to me, because as we start to look at who God is and how God loves through his lived person in Christ, then we start to see, oh, he really values people. He cares about people on the margins. He challenges power. And so we start to be able to move past this idea that we don't engage in this way, or you have to be a part of this partisan party in order to be a Christian. All that sort of stuff starts to fade off because your center is no longer in a political party or in a national story. It's in Christ and how we best live him in the world today. And then the third one that's really big for me is an alternative, because as a white person, I think one of the biggest issues people have with wanting to have curiosity and engage in this way is that the only option we see to the current setup is that we lose power and everything falls apart, and all of a sudden we're in a press group and the nation goes to pieces, and it's this flipping of power. And that's not really what what Be the Bridge is going for anyway. I don't think a lot of people I've talked to, even outside of Be the Bridge, are saying, oh yeah, what we want is for it to become this thing where white people are slaves and America is destroyed. Like, what do I get out of that? I don't, you know, but instead it's a different vision, and one that we have a hard time conceptualizing. We kind of lack the imagination for, and it's a kingdom vision where we're all benefiting by getting rid of these concepts around white supremacy, around Christian nationalism, so that we can all join hands together with our full selves around the throne and worship God. And we can do that wherever the borders start and stop, you know. And that's just a really different way of looking at how we even conceptualize power. I mean, I don't think power necessarily in itself is bad. God discusses how we use power a lot in Ezekiel. I spent a lot of time in Ezekiel, and reading through it, it was interesting how much he talks about, hey, here's a prince, and the prince has power in this way, and that power is to make sure that justice is served, that people aren't oppressed, that even within Ezekiel, it talks about how you know, the tribes have their own land, and then people come in who are foreign, immigrating into these nations, are supposed to be treated as a person in that nation with the same rights and benefits. And so you think about power as not a way to grow your own influence, grow your own wealth, grow more power to push the way things are done in the system. Instead, power is used to make sure that justice is served, that people are cared for, and you know, there's one other thing I was going to say along those lines, but just that different conceptualization of how power is used. And so all that shifts, but people struggle to see that. And so how do we give them that alternate outcome to the current system?
Yeah, that's Micah, Elizabeth, those are both excellent points. I agree wholeheartedly. As usual, I'll do a shameless plug. If you are a pastor and listening to this podcast and want more information on how to be able to change your own discipleship and spiritual formation of your church, we want to invite you to go to our website, bethebridge.com, and there on the tab, you'll see resources, and click on recommended resources. We have a book list that's there from resources from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds that have been vetted by our training team, that we don't recommend books that we have not read, and that we're like, yep, that's good. That's middle ground or healthy.
Great job, Sean.
Yeah, the ones that are wrong and you read them because they're wrong to figure out why they're wrong, we don't recommend them. So these books we like. So so that's one. I don't want to forget that. I would say two things. One, I got the opportunity to be on panel. When I first got hired at Be the Bridge, I got to be on panel with Brian Stevenson. It was during the pandemic. And if you're not familiar with him and his work with Just Mercy and Equal Justice Initiative, they're one of our sister organizations at Be the Bridge. Please Google them. There's a lot of information that's there. But it was the anniversary of the preaching, teaching, and ministry of Anglican evangelical leader George Whitefield, who I had never heard of before. And so I Googled George Whitefield and found out that he was Anglican, Methodist, evangelical from the 1700s, and a devout slave owner. And they sent us as panelists a coin with George Whitefield's face on it and one of his quotes on the back. And they began by saying, even though he was a slave owner, and that's a complicated history, he has all these amazing ideals. And isn't it wonderful that so many people can follow his ethics as we move forward? And Brian Stevenson and I both in the introduction said, no, you cannot say that this person, if he was alive today, would view Brian and I as property, and that we, as African-American men, should live up to that ideal. You have a disconnect. You have a blatant disconnect in values, that I should not want to idolize someone that didn't see me as a human being. And so I think that's one. It's the narratives, and that's really what Micah is talking about, Elizabeth as well, too. We're trying to confront the narratives that people have been taught their entire lives. And you cannot confront a narrative that someone has believed their entire life and not get into trouble. like Micah, I spent 3 years in the book of Ezekiel for my devotional. And Ezekiel 16, I think for me, is most profound because at that time, Israel believed something about themselves. They believed that because they were in the land and because they had the Ark of the Covenant, they had, their version of the Bible, right? The Decalogue, the 10 words, the 10 commandments, because they were in the land and they had the Ark, that they were safe. They could do whatever they wanted to in terms of genocide, marginalizing women, oppressing people groups. There are these narratives that they believed about themselves. And Ezekiel 16 comes in, and God through Ezekiel says, listen, the narrative that you believe about yourself is fundamentally wrong. And it's a very powerful chapter because God says, this is what you believe about yourself on one side. And the second half of that chapter is, here's the actual truth about you. I mean, it's pretty graphic in terms of how they were born, how God found them, how God rescued them, how God delivers them and wants to be in a relationship with them, and how they refute all of that and pretty much become a version of nationalists themselves. And so I think, again, it's going back to the scriptures, like Elizabeth and Micah have both said, and rereading it, I think, with non-Western eyes, I think is huge. The other thing, because of who I am as a person, Tasha, you said the magic word. What are some books? I'm glad you asked. I'm not going to do all of them because then that just gives Elizabeth permission and we'll be here all day. So I think,
Right.
So I think The Next Evangelicalism by Soong Chan Ra is wonderful, rescuing the church from Western cultural captivity. Unsung Truths, how the dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery continues today. Again, that's an excellent resource. Santa Biblia, the Bible through Hispanic eyes, is an excellent resource by Justo Gonzalez. Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys by Dr. Richard Twist. Any of these books are absolutely outstanding. Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. There's a litany of, it's on Elizabeth's desk. There's a litany of resources that are out there. And again, we have a number of those on our website. Again, if you go to bethebridge.com and click on resources, and we recommend, we've got some of those books there, but just encourage you to be able just to start diversifying your readership. Again, if you are questioning, doubtful, or unsure of anything that we've said, again, I want to encourage you to go home and segregate your books. It's the first thing that I do. Again, when I teach at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, before I start the class, I told the students, go home and segregate your books before we get started. Before you refute anything that I'm about to say, before you disagree with me and pull out all these theological treatises that are old as dirt, go home and pull out your books and segregate them and see who shapes your thinking. And that in and of itself, I think, can be a very powerful image because, again, right, it helps folks evaluate their experiences. That for us to be able to say, oh, I've got thoughts and feelings about all of these issues around DACA or Black Lives Matter or anti-Asian hate and all of these different things. There's a good friend of mine, Dr. Ray Hammond, who's in Boston, Massachusetts, who often says, no conversations about us without us. And one of the issues of Christian nationalism is that it allows for all of these conversations about all these different ethnic groups without actually talking to any of those ethnic groups, without actually having them be included in the conversation. And so if you want to know how you're living, how you're thinking, and who's shaping your thinking, who are you inviting to the conversation? And if you're having conversations about those people groups without inviting them, then that's not a true conversation. That's a dictation, right? You're telling someone who you think they are and how they should live and operate, as opposed to the more biblical model, which is we have table fellowship. We are around the table together and we are listening to and learning with each other. That's what it means to be Christian, that the fruit of the gospel, I feel like I'm preaching, that the fruit of the gospel is not, Jesus says you get to go to heaven, right? The fruit of the gospel, that a new community is formed, a diverse community around the table that comes from different nations, but it looks like Revelation 7 and 9, this multitude of every nation, tribe, and tongue that no one can count. That's the good news of the gospel, that these nations that don't get along outside of the church, inside the church, we are equal, we are together, and we love each other, because at the foot of the cross is spiritual unity and cultural diversity.
Amen.
And why don't we see that, just, going back to that, like in this pluralistic society, why don't we see, why don't white evangelicals see that as good and God ordained? Like, why, as a Christian, why wouldn't you see that as a good thing?
Just real quick, because I was talking, and Mike and Elizabeth are both introverts, so I'll just give them a minute because my coffee is kicked in. General Electric, GE, like 60 years ago, and you can go on YouTube and still see the commercial. General Electric, like 60 years ago, they did a commercial. They said their most important product was progress. Think about that for a second. Not the light bulb, not the microwave, not the refrigerator, not the television, the radio. For Black people, the iron, bless that wonderful name, right? None of those things were important. The most important part, they said, was progress. That's good, but it's also very dangerous because progress on the wrong road will get you nowhere. For those of us that are directionally challenged, like myself, I am lost when I get in my car with a GPS, right? It doesn't matter how far I go. If I'm on the wrong road, the further I go, the further I get from where I'm actually trying to arrive. And so I think that's one of the dangers that's happened for white evangelicals in the nation, not all, but for too many, that you've had really for the better part of 700 years, people who've read the same books over and over and over again and created this theology, this political imagination that excludes every other ethnic group. It's been tremendous progress, but it's progress on the wrong road. And so now here we are in 2023, and we have really, to be honest, a brilliant, intellectually sound, theologically robust theology and philosophy that comes out of conservative white evangelical camps about how God is committed to them and to the nation. It's brilliant. It's intellectually sound. It's theologically sound. It's just wrong. And that's the issue, right? They've thought through everything, but the foundation, the launching pad, the start place was off. And so as a consequence, it's completely off course.
I think what it comes down to when thinking about talking to white Christians, and especially those who are deep into even something more like white Christian nationalist spaces, is there's this acceptance of diversity, or maybe even thinking like, yes, well, like God made all the colors. That's fantastic. That's fine. But they've been they've been more discipled by the media they're consuming, the books they're consuming, the fact that all their theology is coming from white spaces, that they're okay talking about diversity and even saying that diversity is something you can pursue. But as soon as you bring up racism or white supremacy, things shut down. Because part of that theology has been so deeply individualistic that your faith, your salvation is just like you and God and having fire insurance, that they don't have a concept, they don't have a theology of community, a theology of diversity. It's like, well, yes, diversity is okay, but I don't get that from my Bible. And so there's just not that depth to the theology there to be able to pull from. And that comes back to this discipleship piece of part of discipling people away from white Christian nationalism is going to be discipling them into these bigger, broader conversations about racial reconciliation and the things that we teach on and train on and coach on and preach on all the time here, because the two aren't really removed from one another in so many ways that, and also it's, that media piece is so complicated, but, I'll see people who are, they're going to church on Sunday and they're absorbing information there that's generally also from the same white theological centers that are very individualistic. And then they're also, consuming tons of media that is pushing the same white Christian nationalism message, which is all over the place in the media, but not just Christian media, mainstream media as well. And then maybe they're also reading your book, Tasha. And so if you think about when we think about the arc of discipleship, the amount of, how much influence can an hour reading a book a week compare to that many hours of being flooded with an individualistic theology and an origin story of white Christian nationalism and news stories that push that we should fear immigrants and that we're losing our culture and that we're swinging away from our roots. That's that's really where the discipleship is happening, is in those spaces. And what they're hearing on Sunday isn't countering what they're hearing in those other messages. And so until we look at this broad range of how and where and why people are being discipled and into what, I don't think that most of those people would probably say, well, I'm not racist, or I'm fine with diversity or whatnot. And that doesn't counter that deep other messaging they're getting elsewhere, right? Like the only thing that really counters that is if we really talk about like, okay, what does that mean? How do we talk about the fact that you're okay with diversity and yet you've chosen a white neighborhood and a white school and a white church and a white workplace and white friends? Like there's a disconnect there.
Yeah.
And also, you're okay with, like, speaking of diversity, you're okay with Black friends as long as they assimilate into your viewpoints, which is pretty common. It's like, oh, we're diverse. We have, these 10 Black people that sit over here, and they go along with what we say. Otherwise, we'll slowly move them out. So
Right.
you got to be aware of that concept too. It's like, do people get to fully belong in that space, even if they don't fully hold your perspectives?
Yeah. And what about this is the final question, then we're gonna close up. But what about some people who really see nationalism as patriotism? And so I want to make sure that we address that. These are, those of you who are listening, with our cultural views, we have the training team actually, who is on this podcast today. Micah is the chief operating officer of Be the Bridge. But one of the things we're doing with our cultural views is we're taking that, we are going to be launching a Be the Bridge Academy, Learning Academy. And Sean can tell us a little bit more about that when as we get ready to close in just a moment. But we are actually going to have topics like this within the academy, where you can go back and listen and watch and that. So this would be a tool. So because we can't dive into everything on this podcast, where but I know one of the things where people are really don't understand the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I think I asked the question, but I don't know if we got a chance. There's so much to cover. I wanted to make sure that we address that, because I know that is one of the things that comes up, where some people feel like just being when you say nationalism, you're just talking about patriotism, and patriotism has evolved into a whole nother narrative in and of itself. I always say, my grandfather served in 2 wars in his time in the military. And in both of those wars, he did not have his full set of rights. When I think about that, I'm like, that's a patriot, to me. But we've conflicted that, and even as I say those words, they've taken on a life of their own that has this like negative triggering effect even with me. So even as I say those words, I'm like, I don't even use those words anymore, because of that. But I wanted us to make sure we just give like an example, or just a brief description of the difference in those, where some people don't feel like, I'm just a patriot.
Yeah. I would say the big difference there is like the quick and easy definition is patriotism is I live here. I maybe even love my country, in a whatever broad nebulous sense. That means I care about it. I want good things for it. I'm willing to serve, give up part of my time or my energy for it. That's patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is saying, not only do I feel those things, but I feel those things because there is a hierarchy, which, God is not a God of hierarchies. He says, I'm the only thing that's above anything else. And it's saying, not only do I love my country, but I love my country because my country is objectively superior, objectively the best. It's at the top of the hierarchy. And so I have to serve in a way that upholds that positionality of the nation. I have to act in a way that upholds that superior position. And that's where we also see the alignment in whenever we have hierarchies, we're looking at, we're talking about racial hierarchy, we're talking about gender hierarchy, we're doing those things, and we're saying like that means that whatever's at the top of those hierarchies is what is being lumped together and defined together. So when we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about hierarchy. When we're talking about patriotism, we're talking about care and concern and willingness to serve.
Okay. So good. Now, a lot of this, as we're closing out, there is a lot in this to lament, but I want to just close out with, because all of this we're lamenting because this is impacting the church. This is impacting our witness. This is impacting this next generation. This is why many Christians of color are saying that Christianity is a white man's religion. This is where this is coming from when we think about all of this. So there is a lot to lament, around this. So, but what I want us to do is, as we close, what hope do we have? What hope do we have? I know a lot of us don't lean into optimism easily. But I would want to know what hope, and Sean, as you talk about the hope you have, I would like for you to talk about the up and coming Be the Bridge Learning Academy this coming soon.
Absolutely.
And we don't have to give any dates or anything. We can just say soon.
It's because Be the Bridge outgrew its previous platform, and the time period we had to launch, we realized, we're doing a lot, so we need somebody else that can do a lot with us. So
there's
that's right.
some technical things in the background that we had to work on, but which is great because we're doing our due diligence, and we're making sure that this is sustainable, lasting, and life-changing, and so it will be launching very soon, shortly.
We want to do it right.
It's taking a little longer, but it's going to come out better in the long run.
Yes.
That's right. I almost said like a fine wine, but I'll keep it like a good cake. There we go. So I think three things, just because I woke up and chose violence, and Elizabeth can't name names and me not name names too. So that way we both will be like, if anybody comes for us, they'll come for the whole team. I think going back to Tasha's last question real quick, what is going on with this? There's a gentleman who spoke who shall remain nameless, but he said something that stayed with me. He talked about how Navigators was founded in 1931, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and Young Life in 1941, Youth for Christ in 1947, Fuller Seminary in 1947, Youth for Christ in 44, rather, Fuller Seminary in 47, Campus Crusade in 51, Youth with a Mission in 1960, and Gordon Conwell in 1969. Those are the leading evangelical institutions in our nation. I was on staff with InterVarsity for 13 years. They're on 550 college campuses. Campus Crusade, prior to the pandemic, as amazing as they are, right? They had 250,000 high school and college students going through their discipleship programs every year. Some of these organizations have been around for 70 years. That means we're talking about parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, doctors, lawyers, pastors, theologians, judges, attorneys, police officers. We've had men and women that have been a part of these organizations really from middle school or high school days on up until if they've come on staff and worked with them their entire lives. And we have a nation that is divided theologically on the issue of race. And so it's not enough to say, are these organizations culpable, but rather how culpable are they? That we have this many people that have never thought about discipleship through a racialized lens. And so that's one of the reasons we say those names, not to shame them, but we say that from a place of conviction to be able to say, Be the Bridge has work to do as an organization. You've got work to do as organizations. We all have work to do as organizations and as people. And one of the ways in which we want to speak into that really is through our Be the Bridge Academy. It's recognizing that there are gaps in all of our spiritual formation. There are gaps in how we've been taught to view the world. There are gaps in terms of how we've been taught to see and understand and learn from other cultures. I never had a Native American teacher. Elementary, middle, high school, college, master's degree. I'm a PhD student. I have yet to have an indigenous theologian or an indigenous professor. I can count on one hand how many Latino professors I've had, and two hands for Black professors, right? And so it's this reality of we've never evaluated who's shaped our thinking before. And so we have to do that hard work to make sure we're including those voices. That's what the Academy is. We want to provide resources from every cultural background for every person at every stage of their journey. If you're at a beginner stage, we've got some introductory courses. If you're at that intermediate level, in other words, you are aware of your own ethnic and cultural background, but you want to learn from other ethnic and cultural backgrounds, we've got some courses for you. If you are a leader or a leader of leaders, if you are pastoring a church, if you are an executive in your organization, you're like, how do we think about some cross-cultural competency training for our team? We want to have resources for folks at every level of the organization, every level of the church, every person at every stage of their journey. And so we'll be launching that this year, God willing, once we put everything on the platform that shall remain nameless. So I'd say that the last thing I'll say, and then I'm done. What gives me hope? Oprah Winfrey said it best, probably about 7 years ago. I was watching 60 Minutes, and they were talking about Bryan Stevenson and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Memorial, and his other museum, From Slavery to Mass Incarceration in Montgomery, Alabama. Oprah's opening words, however, have stayed with me, and it's what gives me hope. She said, there's a reckoning happening in our country right now, and that gives me hope. That we have reached a point in American society, as Dr. King said, where no lie can live forever. And what we see happening right now is the death of the lies that America has taught itself and taught its citizens for centuries. That's what gives me hope. It's a very painful, difficult season right now. It's Friday and it's on the way to Easter Sunday, but we have to go through Good Friday in order to get to Resurrection Sunday. And that's what gives me hope. It's the fact that we have all of these different ethnic groups, including a lot of our white brothers and sisters, that are saying absolutely not. One of the things that I appreciated once January 6th occurred and they had the committees, one of the highest ranking generals in the country, General, I make sure I wrote down his name too. It's General Mark Milley. General Mark Milley, who's a 5-star general, he stood up and said, I want to understand white rage. I need to understand white supremacy. I need to understand how myself as a 5-star general who has taken, an oath to defend the Constitution and the nation can then have its citizens try to overthrow the government. I need to understand this. And for the sitting general to say, I've never thought about this before, I've never examined it before, I thought it was nuts. But seeing what just happened, there are gaps in my leadership as a 5-star general. I need to learn and grow. There's a reckoning happening in the country to where I think what every other ethnic group has believed in part, we all are slowly starting to believe. You can't have reconciliation when you have conflicting narratives. And we've had conflicting narratives for far too long. And now we are starting to tell one story about the true history of the United States of America. And once that story is done being rewritten, we will be a healthier, wiser, more courageous, more confident, more humble nation because we know the truth of the past. We don't run from it, but it inspires how we live in the present and also where we're going in the future.
Micah, what is giving you hope?
I'm going to give two things here. One is that you do not have to save America, and you do not have to save Christianity for Christianity to still persist. And I say that in the sense, especially of sometimes I feel like we feel so much weight on our shoulders, like it's on me to save Christianity. And a lot of people do that, think that it relies on saving America. But if America just disappears, there's no United States, Christianity will still exist. It is growing in parts across the world, even if it's fading here. And it'll still be here even in that case, it existed, was very healthy, thriving in Rome before it became the state religion. So, we need to have that mindset, but that takes a weight off our shoulders, I think, a lot of times, to say, God's got this. We're just trying to align with him. Right. So keeping that in mind. The other one was that I was at a conference a week or two ago. Well, I did a call out, so I'll do a shout out here to Missio Alliance. It was a really good conference that they put on. And one of the panels I was listening to is a diverse panel of speakers talking about race in the church, which is not necessarily a hopeful topic in a lot of cases, but something that they all made a point to reference was the concept that when you look at these things at a 50,000 foot level, it just looks like a mess and there's no hope. But what they hold on to is these small stories in communities of people who they hear about all the time, who come up and say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Hey, this is the work we're doing. Hey, this is what I've learned. And just these individuals and small groups who are becoming, who are growing, doing their own work where it always needs to start. And then that's starting to come out into like their family units, it's coming out into their school, it's coming out into their congregation, it's coming out into their workplace. And so there's these little places where they are seeing a lot of hope. And that's so true for here too. I mean, I ran into someone at that conference that talked about the whiteness intensive we used to lead, Elizabeth. And, and I hear you talking about that a lot, Tasha, when you go around and you speak different places. And so just knowing there's people out there, like there's all the noise, but underneath that, there's people who are listening and wanting to do the work and really changing things is something that really gives me a lot of hope. And that's something that Be the Bridge is really about, is a lot of the community things. We plug the Academy. I also want to make sure we're plugging our community groups, our discussion groups that you can also find on the website. There's a lot of people doing relation building across racial lines there that is leading to some real changes. And so just that's something, those are two things that give me hope.
Yes.
Elizabeth. Yeah, I would say it was several years ago in a very dark period for me, spiritually, theologically, dealing with a lot of church and family trauma and things, and just lots going on, that I really started digging into some spaces outside of traditional Christian spaces, right? Like church on some Sundays was like, okay, I can't shadow those doors, but I can go sit in my garden and me and God can have a chat about this and his people and what they're doing to people. And really leaned into some indigenous theologians and theology of land and theology of space and of really a creation theology that was much deeper than anything I'd ever been given. And so I think what's giving me hope is that with that as a backdrop, with that having influenced my thinking, and as someone who's a little bit obsessed with my garden, in the fall, you cut everything down and you bag up the leaves, and I put them in this big pile in behind the shed of my house, right? And it's everything that's died off. It's everything that can't survive the cold, everything that can't survive the harshness that's coming dies off. And you bag it up and you put it in a pile, and over the winter, it breaks down. It composts, right? It all of those leaves and that brush, everything, it turns to dirt, essentially turns to dirt. And then in the spring, I take that compost and I spread it out throughout my garden, and I plant new seeds and I plant new plants. And no matter how long and cold winter feels, and no matter how dark it gets, and no matter how lonely it is, every single year spring comes, and what was dead and needed to died off, and it feeds the new growth, and it feeds beauty that comes back. And so I lean on the fact that our Creator gives us spring every year.
Yes.
Amen.
I love it. New life, All things are becoming new. And Selah to that. And so I think the thing that gives me hope is knowing that people like you, Sean, Elizabeth, and Micah are locking arms with the community, with the body of Christ, to disciple people into a greater truth. I think that is a broader truth. I think that is the encouragement that the the work that we're doing, it matters, and that it is making a difference. Lives are being transformed for God's glory, and so I think that we can have this conversation, and somebody's going to listen, and there's something that was said, a scripture that was quoted, a statement that was made, a book that was cited, that is going to shift it for people. And in that personal shift that they will have, the places that they intersect, their church, their community, their families, will shift because of that. And all of us here are here because of something like that happened to us personally, And so I am grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful for you for listening. This is going to be in 2 parts. We did not even get to cover book banning. We hit on it a little bit, just a little bit, but we'll have to, what we'll do, Sarah, is we'll come back and we'll do kind of like a cultural views continuation. Like we'll do a separate book ban. I don't know why we thought we can cover white nationalism and book banning. We couldn't even cover white nationalism.
Did you see
in
who's on the
1
call?
hour.
We're not short-winded.
And we should have known. Sean, Elizabeth, Micah, me, trying to cover white nationalism in 1 hour was not going to happen.
We said good morning and had 5 points.
Yes.
So, so let me just say this, and then we can, that way they can have a wrap up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the Be the Bridge podcast. This is Cultural Views with Micah, Elizabeth, and Sean.